Japan-South Korea relations have been complicated over the years. They have been a source of contention between the two countries ever since. According to a poll conducted by BBC, about 79% of South Koreans view Japanese influence negatively. Today I'm going to talk about the history of relations between Japan and South Korea and why they are so contentious today. The history of Japan and its relations with the Korean peninsula go back many thousands of years. There was an attempt to invade Japan by the Mongol Yuan dynasty. This happened when the Mongols ordered the Korean king to construct 1,000 warships in order to invade Japan. However, the two Mongol-Korean fleets were destroyed by a divine wind called the kamikaze, which was a wind that protected Japan from invasion. During the 13th through 15th centuries, Korea was attacked by a series of skirmishes by Japanese pirates. Korea was devastated at a time of the Japanese invasions of Korea, which occurred from 1592 to 1598. Most of Korea's cultural heritage was destroyed at that time. More atrocities from the Japanese include cutting of the noses and ears of the civilians and soldiers alike to increase their kill quota. Afterwards, 11 diplomatic relations were sent from Korea to Japan from 1607 to 1811 to restore basic diplomatic relations. The colonization of Korea by Imperial Japan is a defining point between the relations of the two countries. The process of the colonization of Korea by Japan was started by the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876, which was signed in February 27. It was designed to open Korea up for Japanese trade. It also granted the extraterritoriality of the Japanese citizens. The Japanese people, Korea prospered during Japanese rule and a constitutional government, freedom of speech, strong rule of law, and legal rights, and Korean-led industrialization were all promoted by the Korean elite. There was strong opposition by many Koreans of Japanese rule. The first of these incidents was the Evo Incident, in which Japanese training cadre, legation, diplomats, policemen, and students were killed. Korea tried to assert its independence by the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ended Korea's tributary relationship with Qing China. A last-ditch effort at attempts of independence failed with the assassination of Empress Myeong-song by the Japanese agents. Attempts for independence also failed with the Independence Club, which supported for the westernization of Korea. However, it clashed with the government, when it brought into conflict with the emperor and the conservatives in court. Korean independence was finally severed by the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1905. After the conquest of Korea by Japan, the country had become a protectorate in 1905. In 1910, the country was officially annexed by the Japanese Empire. Korea had been modernized and industrialized by Japan for the purpose of Japan itself. Agriculture, fishing, forestry, and industry increased tenfold during Japanese rule in terms of economic output. Japan wanted to improve the agriculture in Korea because of its growing need of rice. The Korean people were only allowed to have a few rice at a time. The country had a mercantile economy with the construction of transportation infrastructure with the purpose of extracting and exploiting resources such as raw material, timber, foodstuff, mostly rice and fish, and mineral resources, coal and iron ore. The Japanese developed port facilities and a main trunk runway from Busan to Seoul to the northern border with China. A lot of heavy industries such as chemicals, steel mills, and munitions were built. Most Koreans would feel repressed of colonial rule. There was strict surveillance upon the Korean people. Freedom of speech was also curtailed in Korea at that time. In 1907, the Japanese government passed a law that prohibited the publication of local papers. These laws, however, were relaxed in 1920, and in 1932, Japan made Korean publication just as equal as Japanese publication. Despite these laws, newspapers were still seized. Before the war, the Korean language was strictly banned, and they had to speak Japanese at all times. They were also encouraged to adopt Japanese names. The issue of comfort women is also a sensitive issue facing Korea today. Many Korean women were subject to prostitution for the Japanese soldiers. They were literally forced into sexual slavery as well. Most of them were relocated to rural locales in which they were promised with factory employment. They were falsely classified as nurses and secretaries. How they got there, they were enlisted in the military station through force, kidnapping, coercion, and deception. The Korean comfort women were most of them were under the age of 18. They would probably see about 30 through 40 men a day, and it was something that they were forced to do. Japan has reestablished their relations with South Korea, which was signed with the Treaty of Basic Relations. The treaty was signed in June 22, 1965, and established basic diplomatic relations between Japan and South Korea. Japan recognizes South Korea as the only legitimate government in the peninsula. Tokyo has extended another 200 million credit to Seoul. Seoul has vehemently opposed the occasional visitation of Japanese politicians in North Korea to repatriate residents affected by colonization. Prime Minister Sado attended official functions in July, the first visit of a Japanese premier to post-war Korea. There has been repeated contact between the two countries with new air routes, tourism, and trade. There are currently disputes over the Liancourt rocks. The islands are occupied by South Korea, but ownership is still disputed. Militarily, they are at the same boat. Both countries perceive North Korea and China as a threat. In response, they signed a military pact together in 2012. Lastly, even with South Korean popular culture experiencing major popularity in Japan, Japanese media is actively censored in Korea. The government claims that this is due to the preservation of South Korean culture. However, this is due to the rampant anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea. The ban was partially lifted in 1998, and in 2004 the ban on Japanese CDs and DVDs has been lifted. Currently, it is still illegal to broadcast Japanese music and television dramas. Today, relations between the two countries is complex due to history and war. Contention between the two countries is high, which makes relations much bitter today.